Okay. Well, good evening and welcome. My name is Corey Wills. I'm with the Climate Change and Environmental Planning Club at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'll be your moderator for this evening on this exciting panel on the impacts of sea level rise in Philadelphia. Our presenters for the evening are Julia Rockwell from the Philadelphia Water Department, Allison Lassiter from the University of Pennsylvania, and Carolyn Moseley from Eastwick United. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Julia to get us started.
Great, thanks, Corey. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes, okay, thanks for the nods. All right, I'm gonna try and share my screen here since I have a slide deck to go through. Whoops, it'd be helpful if I started on the first slide. There we go. Are you guys seeing presentation view? Okay, great. Well, it's good to be here with you guys this evening. So as Corey mentioned, my name is Julia Rockwell, and I manage the Climate Change Adaptation Program at the Philadelphia Water Department. And I thought tonight I'd go through some slides that will provide you with a very brief introduction to PWD and who we are as a utility. And then I'm going to transition into some information on climate change science and really focus on what we already know today and what we are projected to see in terms of climate change in the future. And then I'm going to talk a bit about actionable science and why we really need it to inform planning and policy, and how we also use that information to adapt. And since we're focused tonight on sea level rise, I'm going to try and talk about all these different things with sea level rise being top of mind. So to begin with, Philadelphia Water Department is a one water utility, meaning that we provide drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater services to the city of Philadelphia. And as you can imagine, providing all of those services requires an extensive amount of infrastructure, some of which I have listed on this slide. Just a few highlights are that we get our drinking water from the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River, and we have 3 major drinking water treatment plants, 2 of which are on the Schuylkill, and our largest is on the tidal Delaware. We also have 3 major water pollution or wastewater treatment plants, and those are all located on the tidal Delaware River. We have thousands of miles each of water and sewer mains. And in terms of stormwater, we have a large-scale green stormwater infrastructure program called Green City Clean Waters, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's our program to meet our combined sewer overflow or CSO requirements. A couple years ago in 2014, the department decided that because of the critical services we provide and all of the infrastructure we own, operate, and maintain, that we needed to have a program that was focused on climate change risk specifically. So that's when we initiated our Climate Change Adaptation Program, otherwise known as CCAP. And our goal is to reduce the risks and also the expenses that PWD will face from the impacts of climate change by identifying and implementing effective and feasible adaptation strategies. And I'll talk more about what that actually means in practice, but I have this image here on the screen as providing another example of what our program is really all about. And it's about getting the department to view everything we're doing through the lens of climate change. So thinking about climate change across all of our business functions, that includes the planning and design of infrastructure, the management of our systems, operations, emergency management, all kinds of things. So I'm now going to transition into what we know today in terms of climate science. For those of you that were in or are in Allison's water policy class, I already mentioned to Corey some of these slides you may have recently seen, but I just like to make sure we're all on the same page with some of the climate science facts. So this video is going to be showing temperature anomalies going back to 1880 and moving forward into present day. And any area of the globe that's orange or red represents warmer than normal temperatures, and any area that's blue represents cooler than average temperatures. And it's going to play really quickly, so I can play it twice. It's moving through time at a rapid pace, but you can see just that last image of what global warming looks like right now is really pretty impactful. We have seen extensive warming and accelerated warming just in the recent past. And that's, of course, globally, but in Philadelphia, we are also already experiencing the impacts of climate change. In terms of air temperature, for example, Summer average temperatures have increased by about 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. In terms of precipitation, as the atmosphere warms, it's able to hold more moisture. So we're seeing more intense and frequent rainfall events. These images on the slide are from 2 recent storm events. The 2 images on the left are from Tropical Storm Isaias, where we saw devastating flooding in our Eastwick neighborhood. And the 2 photos on the right are from the more recent remnants of Hurricane Ida, where we saw really devastating riverine flooding in Center City, Philadelphia. And then sea level rise. So we are also already experiencing sea level rise in Philadelphia. We're not often thought of as a coastal city, but we are located on the Delaware River, which is tidal all the way up to Trenton, New Jersey. And we have over 100 years of river elevation data at a NOAA tide gauge station that's located right in the city and is indicated by the little yellow circle on the map on the right-hand side. And what that data is telling us is that we are witnessing about 0.13 inch per year of, in terms of a rate of sea level rise. And while that may seem kind of low, it's actually 50% higher than the global average rate of sea level rise and is only expected to accelerate in the future. And the reason our local rate is so much higher has to do with many different local factors, one of them being land subsidence and the fact that the land along the northeast coast of the United States is actually sinking at the same time as these sea levels are rising. So we see faster rates than other areas of the country and the world. And the bad news is that with climate change, all of these impacts will only increase in severity, and we're basing that off of projections that are outlined in local reports, like the one I'm showing here called Growing Stronger Toward a Climate Ready Philadelphia, which was released by our city's Office of Sustainability a few years ago. These projections are also contained for our region in the National Climate Assessment, which is also shown, the Climate Science Special Report, and then the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that also contains projections for our region. So across all these different reports, it's unanimous that in our region and in Philadelphia specifically, we're going to continue to see increasing sea levels, more precipitation, higher air temperatures, more extreme storm events, and the potential for more frequent and severe drought. So our utility recognizes, and the city as a whole really recognizes, that adaptation planning is essential to reducing our risks. When it comes to sea level rise, we're facing many different risks. 2 of the main areas of risk we are currently working on are shown here. So coastal inundation due to sea level rise and storm surge and flooding of our assets along the tidal Delaware River is a major concern. And this GIF on the left-hand side that's replaying is showing 1 through 7 feet of sea level rise in the vicinity of one of our water pollution control plants that is also immediately adjacent to the airport, which you can kind of see in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. So coastal inundation is a major concern. We also see other types of flooding in our city, riverine flooding in the non-tidal portions of our rivers, creeks, and streams, and also infrastructure-based flooding when the capacity of our drainage system is exceeded. That leads to localized flooding, and it occurs during intense rainfall events. But of course, sea level rise, we're dealing with everything that's coastal. And then the map on the right is referring to some water quality risks related to sea level rise, specifically salinity intrusion that we are researching. And I think Allison is going to talk more about that risk. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but in a nutshell, there is what's known as a salt front that sits on an average basis around Wilmington, Delaware. It's shown on this map by the purpley blue shaded area. And it's where the salt water of the bay meets the fresh water of the Delaware River. And with sea level rise, we are concerned that that salt front will move closer to our largest drinking water intake, which is also labeled in purple on this map. And if we start pulling in salty water, it's a major problem because we only have a conventional treatment plant, and conventional treatment plants don't remove salt. So this is another huge area of research for us. And then really, in addition to reducing our risks, we're also really trying to reduce future costs by planning for climate change. This image is from Hurricane Sandy and some of the flooding impacts in New York City. With that storm, New York saw up to 9-foot storm surges, and that resulted in about $3 billion in damages to New York City DEP's water and wastewater systems. So really a lot of this work too is about making sure we are avoiding, hopefully, some of these major costs that we could see in the future, and really, maintaining affordability of our utility and the rates that we use to basically fund our infrastructure. Okay, so that's some background on the climate science side of things and projections in Philadelphia. I'll now move into a bit of information on actionable science, what it is and why we need it. So these phases at the top of this slide are showing how we basically approach our work in our climate change adaptation program. We definitely really value having a very deep understanding of the climate science, analyzing it, using it to inform plans, and then of course, implementing adaptation strategies. So we're really trying to answer these questions of how and when will the impacts of climate change affect the operations and management of our systems, and what specific strategies can we employ to reduce our risks and maintain levels of service across our drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems. So fundamental to all of that work is what's known as actionable science, and it's often defined as data analyses, projections, or tools that can support decisions regarding the management of the risks and impacts of climate change. So in terms of sea level rise, we are working with projections that come from a 2017 publication by NOAA, and NOAA basically generated localized projections, including for Philadelphia. So these are specific to Philadelphia. And in this report, they have a range of different scenarios. And I've pulled out 3 of the sea level rise scenarios on this graphic. So there's a low scenario, an intermediate high scenario, and an extreme scenario. And it's very obvious that as we move forward in time out towards the end of the century, these scenarios really start to diverge. So the low scenario is saying we could see close to 2 feet of sea level rise by 2100, while the extreme scenario is saying we could see closer to 11 feet of sea level rise. So as you can imagine, that introduces a lot of uncertainty into our planning, and that is a challenge for water utilities and other sectors across the country and the world. Our program, because of certain factors, which I'll talk a bit more about on a future slide, has chosen to focus on this intermediate high scenario as our primary planning scenario when we are looking at protecting our infrastructure and increasing resilience. And that scenario indicates about 6.4 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And really, there are a lot of reasons why there's so much divergence in these scenarios. A lot of it has to do with, of course, the fact that we don't know what emission scenario the world is going to track on in the future. It all depends on how quickly, as a global community, we are able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And also some of the modeling behind this, there are many challenges with that modeling, and it's super complex. And one of the areas that's harder to model is collapse of the ice sheets. And if the Greenland and/or Antarctic ice sheets collapse, that will contribute in a huge way to sea level rise. So these are very complex dynamic processes that scientists continue to make improvements on the modeling side, but it continues to be a challenge. And so that's why, a few reasons why you see such a range in the future projections. So we took these projections, we analyzed them, we tried to get an understanding of these different scenarios. And we then, as a team, wanted to apply them to the risks that we're facing, most of which or all of which I've mentioned. So the flooding of our assets at surface, so things like treatment plants and pump stations, and then also below grade assets like our drainage system. So our drainage system is actually gravity driven. So we have many outfalls on the tidal Delaware River. And if the river elevation gets high enough, the system will no longer be able to release water. If that becomes the case, then we're looking at the potential for needing a lot more pumping, many more pumping stations. So that's that second bullet there, increased energy demand. The tricky thing with that is, of course, if we're increasing our energy demand, it's kind of in conflict with our climate mitigation and greenhouse gas reduction goals. So that's a whole nother area, right? This kind of conflict you get when you have to actually employ adaptation strategies that are very energy intensive, but that's something we might be looking at down the road. And then, of course, degraded source water quality and salinity, which I already mentioned. So going back to this idea of actionable science, some of the tools that we have developed to make the sea level rise projections actionable and allow us to evaluate these risks are listed here. In addition to analyzing projections and also developing storm surge estimates on the Delaware River, our team also built a customized GIS screening tool for PWD assets. And Allison on this call, one of my team members, has done a lot of work supporting development and updating that tool. We also have proposed a design flood elevation for the department for all of our assets that are located along the tidal Delaware River to make sure they're going to be resilient to sea level rise and storm surge in the future. And then we have a whole team at the department analyzing this issue of salinity, and they are running a very complex 3D model to kind of wrap our heads around when we might need to adapt to some of those impacts. I'm going to pull out one example from that list and show you some products. So these maps are going to be showing products from our GIS screening tool. This is an image of our Southwest Water Pollution Control Plant, the plant that is closest to the airport and also most vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. And we mapped that intermediate high sea level rise scenario from NOAA that I referred to earlier. And this image is showing what that scenario projects for the 2060s. It projects 2.89 feet of sea level rise. So this is on top of mean higher high water or average high tide. And you can see that the plant isn't really at risk yet. But if we add 100-year storm surge on top of that 2.89 feet of sea level rise, almost the entire facility is inundated. Of course, it only gets more extreme if we go out to the end of the century to 2100, when that sea level rise scenario is indicating we could see about 6.4 feet of sea level rise. That is what this map is showing. So this would be permanent inundation at our facility. Again, it's not looking good. Majority of the facility is inundated. And as you would expect, it gets worse when you add storm surge on top of it. So this is why we are, building all these tools and making sure we are plugging in the science where we can to really understand where our biggest risks lie and start the process of identifying how we adapt, which is what I will wrap up my slides with. So our team is basically taking a three-pronged approach right now to reducing our short and long-term risks. The first approach is to mainstream or integrate the use of climate projections in all of our infrastructure planning and design processes. We recently released to the department a set of climate resilient planning and design guidance, which is the fundamental way in which we're trying to mainstream the use of climate information, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. We're also carrying out comprehensive risk assessments to identify specific adaptation projects that are needed. So that facility I was just showing on those maps, we are actually doing an asset by asset risk assessment at that facility to understand what we need to do to protect it against future flooding. Do we need to harden the facility, elevate certain assets, or are we really talking about needing to potentially install a seawall or something like that? So risk assessments are a big part of our work. And then on the non-structural side, we're also exploring changes to policies, standards, and practices within the department, and also more on a citywide scale. Just wanted to provide a bit more information on this idea of mainstreaming the use of climate science. So the graphic on the left is the cover page for our climate resilient planning and design guidance, which provides information for our planners and engineers on what climate change projections, including sea level rise projections, air temperature projections, and precipitation projections, they should consider when they're planning new projects, when they're performing analyses, or retrofitting existing assets or building new ones. And in the development of this guidance document, there were a few planning considerations that we kept in mind through the whole development process. One is the useful service life of our assets. So once our utility constructs an asset and it's in the ground, usually it has to remain viable for many, many decades. Because of that, we tend to look at climate projections that are towards the end of the century, recognizing this long useful service life. And those two photos at the bottom of the screen are showing one of our raw water basins, initially being constructed in 1903, and getting some much needed updates in 2014. So that just gives you an idea of, the useful service life of some of our infrastructure. Criticality is also a big consideration. By default, because we are a utility and provide critical services, we consider all of our infrastructure to be critical. And that's why we tend to look at climate projections that have to do with higher emission scenarios, so kind of more worst case projections, because we want to be prepared if that actually occurs. And that directly relates to risk tolerance. So generally, as a utility, because of the critical services we provide, we have a low risk tolerance. And again, that's why we usually choose projections that reflect a higher emission scenario and more severe impacts in the future. Even if those projections are lower probability, if they're still plausible, we want to make sure we're prepared for them. And then adaptive capacity is another big planning component to all of our work. And this has to do with really addressing the uncertainty in climate change. We are certain about the impacts we're going to see generally, like more sea level rise, higher air temperatures, but the magnitude and timing of those impacts is uncertain. So with our infrastructure solutions, if there are ways in which we can make that infrastructure adaptive over time and enable it to be modified to continue to function in changing climate conditions, that is ideal. And I think the most straightforward example of this is if we were to build a seawall to a certain elevation today, that maybe would be for a 2050s sea level rise projection. We'd want to design it so it is wide enough so that in the future we could build it to be higher. So add more height to that wall in case we're starting to see that sea levels are starting to accelerate and we're not going to get the protection we need from the wall we originally built. So that's one example. For the sake of time, I'm going to leave it there, but I'm happy to get more into anything I've touched on in my slides during our Q&A. But generally where our program is headed is we're really continuing to work on these priorities that are focused primarily on mainstreaming the use of climate information and implementing that guidance document I mentioned. We're also going to be moving into more implementation phases in the future, figuring out what specific adaptation strategies and investments are needed. And then building internal capacity and engaging with our city and regional partners is also a big part of our work. And along those same lines, actually partnering and leveraging the knowledge of cities and utilities from across the country has been a super big part of our program and really helpful part of the work we do, to be part of groups like the Water Utility Climate Alliance, which I'm showing here. This is a map of all the member agencies, and I can talk more about WUCA if anyone's interested, but it's been really helpful to just have a peer network to move the ball forward on this issue of adaptation. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your guys' questions.
Thanks, Julia. That was great. I think we're going to hold questions to the end just to keep it streamlined. But that was fantastic. Thank you so much. So next we're going to hear from Allison Lassiter about her research.
Hey, let me see if I can share my slides. Hold on, let's see. Oopsies. I'm like clicking all the wrong buttons here. There we go. Okay, are you on present? You're seeing presentation view now? Yeah. Well, thanks. Well, it's so great to follow Julia's talk. Mine is directly building on pretty much everything that she laid out. I'm going to be talking to you about drinking water vulnerability and rising seas, and how Philadelphia is like a really interesting case that maybe we can think of, and then sort of expand our sights beyond that a little bit. So I think typically when people think about sea level rise, images like this pop to mind, and things like losing roads initially strike people as being one of the big results of sea level rise. I'd say that that is definitely a problem and interesting, but is not actually the fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem has to do with, well, or maybe the first problem that we'll start to experience has to do with salt, and the salt that's being introduced into coastal environments from sea level rise and the consequences of that, specifically on drinking water. So we're going to talk briefly about where coastal drinking water comes from. From those of you who are in my water policy class, you'll be well versed on this at this point. And then specifically about the case of Philadelphia, and then a couple thoughts on how we can manage salt in the short term and the long term. So coastal drinking water for cities really comes from maybe five sources, but 4 primary ones right now. Surface water, groundwater, desalinated ocean water or brackish water that's near the ocean, or recycled wastewater. There's not sort of any other magic sources. For coastal cities, there are some that are imported, like that are bringing water from inland are not going to be super vulnerable to sea level rise for their drinking water supplies. So we're really talking about some specific subset of cities. So for coastal cities, they get their water from a local river or stream, or using groundwater from a local unconfined aquifer, or maybe a bit from a confined aquifer. So across the US, here's a map where we have major surface water sources scaled by volume. You can see that there are a lot of places that draw water from there's a lot of surface water, and basically everywhere along the coast where there is a river meeting the coast, especially on the East Coast. Historically, communities located there because it was a great place to be from a trade perspective. It was very economically productive to locate there. So there's basically where every single one of these rivers meets the ocean, there's a large community there that's drawing water from that river. On the East Coast, you can see that we have these aquifers that kind of knit together the states of the Eastern Seaboard, and those are quite vulnerable to seawater intrusion. So the thing that I think a lot of people don't really consider too much is this issue that when you have both above ground and below ground, and I think the below ground thing is what people probably don't think about as much. So you have fresh water flowing off the land, whether that's above ground or below ground, and then you have the ocean over here. And then it moves inland or moves out based on tides, like high tide or lunar cycles. And so where those two meet, you have this salt line, and that's kind of going back and forth all the time. So with sea level rise, we would expect that salt line to start to push further and further inland, and that's what we're concerned about. Okay, so here's Philadelphia, as Julia just talked about. We're on the Delaware River, which is actually an estuary. What's unique about the Delaware River is they've been monitoring the location of what they call the salt line, that like brackish zone between freshwater and seawater, for longer than anywhere else in the world that I know of. All right, so one of the major reasons they do this is because, I mean, Julia just kind of talked about some of this, but here's a map of Philadelphia and 3 of its drinking water, well, it's 3 drinking water treatment plants. So on the right, you'll see one that's called the Baxter Water Treatment Plant, Baxter WP, and that serves 60% of Philadelphia's population. And its zones that it serves are up there in the brown and also in the red. So the salt line, which is shown here on this map, which is typically around Wilmington, migrates up and down the Delaware River. And during what's known as the drought of record, where there was a drought in 1964, I think it was, that was the most extreme drought the area had experienced to date. The salt line migrated up from Wilmington towards that red marker, that red asterisk, River Mile 102. So got dangerously close to the drinking water intake, that Baxter drinking water intake that supplies 60% of Philadelphia's water. Also, there's groundwater reserves across the way in Camden that it got close to as well. So managing the Delaware River water flows to make sure that doesn't happen again has been a big deal for a long time. And it's one of the primary objectives of what's known as the Delaware River Basin Commission. So Philadelphia is very unusual in that it sits inside of this regional water management body, watershed-based management body called DRBC. And there's only, to my knowledge, 2 watershed-based management organizations in the world that are trying to manage salinity. And the other one, to my knowledge, is out in California, and they have very different strategies. I've actually been interviewing a bunch of people from both of these organizations recently. DRBC, what they've primarily done to help manage salinity here is control all of these surface water flows through the watershed. So by ensuring that they have as much water coming down the Delaware River as possible, they're able to kind of push that salt line out to the ocean, or they have been historically at least. So there's all of these reservoirs that are located throughout the basin. I'm going to zoom into a few of them that are basically ready to go in the case of a low flow scenario in the Delaware. So some of these will be released and then it pushes that salt line out. So this is the primary salt line management strategy in the area. Okay, so let's take a step back here and think, what does it mean to be salty? Not angry. So it's important to note that water treatment plants can't remove salt, as Julia just said. And I've read in documents, perhaps Julia can confirm here, that if the salt line were to reach the Baxter water treatment plant, the plant would stop operation. So why is that? So the salt line is 250 parts per million salinity. We'll get back to that in just a second. And water starts to kind of taste salty at 250 parts per million. But the bigger problem is not actually the taste of salty drinking water. It's more the damage that it would cause to the equipment that's in the facilities. So a lot of these places, the pumps, the pipes are not equipped to handle saltier water. Okay, so let's think about that 250 ppm a little bit more. Ocean water is much, much saltier than that. So ocean water is about 35,000 parts per million salt. So that salt kind of tapers a lot as it goes upriver towards the Baxter treatment plant. And we can consider like fresh water, anything under about 1,000 parts per million salt. So like river water could be as much as, it could be that salty. People can drink a lot of salt, like a Gatorade, I think, is about 400 parts per million salt. And so there's different sensitivities to salt by populations. So pregnant people, people with hypertension, they're going to be more sensitive to salt. But water starts to taste salty to everyone at about 200 parts per million. So right now, there's no federal salinity standards that you have to comply to. And it's because there's not like this incredibly clear link between the impacts of salt and human health. So most of the salt in our diet comes from food, and we eat a lot of salt through food. So any sort of salt that would be introduced through water would be pretty marginal compared to what we're usually eating. So it's more about, like, the salt issue has more to do with infrastructure lifespans and operations than it does human health, though there definitely are human health implications. Right now, the water from the Baxter intake is, I mean, has salt in it. It ranges from about 19 to 42 parts per million salt. And the water that's coming downstream in the Delaware, this is interesting, is the highest salt concentration that's ever been seen so far. It's higher than it was during that scary moment where the salt line was approaching the Baxter treatment plant in the 60s. And that's just from road salts being applied upriver, and also from things like people, like our wastewater treatment plants that are upriver, having higher loads of salt in them as well. So there's just salt all around. Okay, so the sea level rise, it kind of just worsens the salt problem. So Julia mentioned that they're doing a lot of modeling of sea level rise in the area. And I think this is probably, I know for sure this is not the latest data. This is the latest public facing data that's been out there. And so models are improving. And what we can see in this particular model, so they have where the 0, 1, 2, and 3 are is where you'd expect the salt line to be given no feet of sea level rise, 1, 2, or 3. So you can see with 3 feet of sea level rise, the drinking water intakes are actually kind of, are maybe safe. So Philadelphia is kind of on the edge of being close, of experiencing salinity at its drinking water intakes, but exactly what happens will depend on downstream water flows. It will depend on emergency reserves in those reservoirs that are upstream. And it will also depend on things like whether a storm surge comes through the area. So will we get hit by another Hurricane Sandy type thing, but this time it's focused on Philadelphia instead of New York. And then also another thing to remember is that a lot of our maps, or sort of the way we're talking about sea level rise, we cut off, I've been thinking about it in my work up until like 2050, 2060, Julia just mentioned up to 2100, but it's not like sea level rise will stop at those dates. So it will progress. And so if it's not 3 feet of rise, I mean, eventually one day, salts will hit the drinking water intakes of like the Baxter intake. I mean, we don't know the time horizon for that exactly, but unless climate change were to kind of halt, we're tracking to get there eventually. So one thing that the DRBC has said recently is that sea level rise may require increased releases from storage to augment river flows to repel salinity and or costly modifications by water suppliers to treat increases in dissolved solids. There's some work, as far as I can tell, from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to increase some storage up in the watershed, but for the most part, it doesn't look like that's a real option. So it looks like we're more on the end of costly modifications. So what are some options? In the short term, there's probably 2 that we can maybe think about. One of them is this ongoing upstream flow management. This would actually be fine for the immediate scenario, given where we think the salt line will move with that 0, 1, 2, and 3 feet of sea level rise. We could also think about how there would maybe be short-term times where the salt line would get closer to the intakes. Maybe that would be a high tide, maybe that would be a storm surge. So what could we do to kind of make it through some short period of time where the water is too salty to pull from the Delaware? One way could be to build more local water storage. Another way could be to have programs in place that could quickly reduce freshwater use. So if you had some large water users online that could go offline, so maybe that's an industrial user, that would be a way to kind of effectively create supply in a short-term scenario. In the long term, it gets a little bit trickier. So depending on exactly what the sea level rise scenarios are, these may or may not be needed. Well, let's talk about that. So the first option, I think, is, the easiest option, and one that the PWD has explored a lot in the past, which is just to move the intakes. So you can move the intakes a little further upstream or to different depths in the river, and there's different salinity at different depths. Another more substantial option, I guess, would be to think about broadening the water portfolio. So are there any other sources of water that could be brought online that would reduce pressure on the Baxter water intake? So one thing that I think is intriguing is building distributed rainwater capture and using that to meet some of our non-potable water needs. So right now, Philadelphia has an aggressive rainwater capture program, but it's not usually used to meet non-potable water needs afterwards. It's just sort of is used to capture and store water, or detain water before it goes into the stormwater system. So we could think about augmenting supplies like that. There may also be some opportunity in the future to build a water recycling facility or desalination facility. These are really expensive and, well, particularly for desal, very expensive and space intensive options. I don't think they should be our first options, but they're certainly options. Another thing that could happen too is something like, they're doing this in Orange County, California, which is part of this other watershed I mentioned that's managing salinity. Building seawater intrusion barriers. There's also talk of doing this down in Hampton Roads, Virginia, which is the idea of taking a low saline water source and pumping it into an area to create a barrier. So you could do something like have a wastewater treatment plant, use that, recycle the water there, take the wastewater that's lower salinity than the water that's coming, well, the sea level rise water that's kind of coming upstream, and use that to actively create like a pumping water in and creating a barrier, like going through a car wash kind of. And so that could potentially be a tool to help decrease salinity exposure at those drinking water intakes. The thing is, well, there's kind of two things to consider here. Is Philadelphia is kind of on the edge of being safe from a lot of these sea level rise scenarios, but they're emblematic of a lot of other communities. And Philadelphia is in a unique position that it's part of this larger watershed management organization. So they have some tools in place already to help manage salinity coming upriver. This is not the case in most other coastal communities. So Philadelphia is better prepared for a sea level rise scenario than a lot of places are. But anyway, for both Philadelphia and for all of these other coastal communities, it's gonna take some creativity to think of new scenarios. And there's not, I've been struggling to find a citation on this, but the sort of like rule of thumb some people have is that large infrastructure projects often take 30, 35 years between being planned and being built. So if we want to start thinking about building a large infrastructure project, not saying that's the right solution, but like something like a desal facility would need to be, the planning would need to start now. So it's time to start envisioning these scenarios today, both for maybe, I mean, desal is something that it's a pretty straightforward solution. I don't think it's the best solution. So coming up with some more creative scenarios that are a little more out of the box will take more iterations and thoughts and more coalition building and more conversations. And all of these things will need to begin to happen if they're going to happen in time. So there's a lot of creative thought that can be brought to this, but there's certainly a kind of a problem that's looming. We don't know exactly how it will play out. But even with that uncertainty, it's time to develop some scenarios. And that is it. Thanks.
That was fantastic. Thanks, Allison. All right. I've been getting some great questions, private messaged, but again, we'll save them till the end. All right, Carolyn, are you ready to go? Carolyn, if you're talking, you're muted.
Yes, I'm sorry. I have myself on mute.
No worries.
Do I screen share?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. Why not? Okay, I've got it up. What am I doing wrong here?
Did you click the share screen button within Zoom?
That might help. All right. Can you see now?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
Oh,
again,
wait, Carolyn, sorry, you're not full screened. If you could hit the present.
Okay.
So it has a little button at the bottom right that looks like a projector screen.
Yeah.
Click on that. Well, this works too.
Okay, wait a minute. Now I want you able to get the benefit of it. I can't.
Let's see.
You mean the control?
One moment.
Okay, I'm giving you approved remote to Corey.
Okay. There we go. All right, I will give control back to you.
Thank you.
There we go.
Okay. Oh. We'll let this play for you.
Scream at the top. trapped in a crowded room, but I feel so alone tonight. Would anybody care if I disappeared? Swim inside the sea of my deepest fears, trying to kick to the surface, but I feel so alone tonight. I think I need to save myself. Ooh, I think I need to save myself. Ooh, I think I need to save myself. Ooh, I think I need to save myself. Cling to a thread of light and wait. Look to the stars and see what they say. Hope doesn't seem so far away when I close my eyes. And nothing's gonna change if I just stay still. Gonna find a way, gonna climb this hill. Breaking the chains, gonna save myself. Think I need to save myself. Ooh, I think I need to save myself. Ooh, I think I need to save myself. Ooh, I think I need to save myself. Think I need to save myself.
Okay. That's sea level rise. That's climate change. That's how it impacts human beings. As you know, Eastwick is located in it is the southern most portion of the city of Philadelphia. We are in a bowl, if you can imagine a bowl. Our level, we're actually below sea level. We're at the lowest elevation of the city. And as you could see from that video, Eastwick has been documented as flooding well over 65 years. And due to climate change and sea level rising, it's only getting worse. And from the clip that you just saw, you see the impact that it has on human beings. Last year, we were hit by Tropical Storm Isaias. Over 300 residents were impacted by that storm, some of which are still in recovery mode because we didn't get a declaration of disaster from FEMA. There was no money at the state or the city level to help people out back here. This has been an ongoing issue, along with other environmental issues, that this community has been fighting since its very existence. So finally, the community, the leadership within the community, we've had to come up and search for our own solutions to the problem because nothing had ever been addressed for us. We're trying to save our lives. Losing a life is not an option for us. We almost lost 2 lives back here during Tropical Storm Isaias, an elderly couple who could no longer climb up their stairs. When rescue came, they were sitting on their steps with water up to their necks, holding hands, waiting for the inevitable to happen to them. They were rescued just in time. The trauma that people have suffered is unimaginable. When it rains, they're afraid to be in their homes, but yet they're afraid to leave their homes. Children are in counseling because they think the man is going to come and take them out of the window again. People lost memories not just items, but memories. Things that you and I might take for granted. It could be that last picture of grandma, mom, dad. It may not mean anything to anybody else, but it means something to you. People have been flooded multiple times. How often are you supposed to rebuild your life? How many times can you do that? We've had residents to just up and walk away from their homes because they can't live like that anymore. But that is demonstrative of climate change and of sea level rising. We saw Center City go underwater. Recently, just because of a bad storm, we saw Delaware Avenue underwater. Some people in Eastwick are just numb to it because it's happened to them so frequently. But what we have to do is get in the mode of preparing ourselves to deal with that. We have to seek alternatives to mitigate the damage and to increase the safety factor. An alternative solution that the community came up with is a land swap. We have large tracts of vacant property, vacant city-owned property back here, some of which is in 100-year floodplain, but much of which is in a 500-year floodplain, which would get those residents to safety. It's a plan to save lives without penalizing people for homes that should never have been built along a creek that was known to flood, for homes where the developer dredged the Delaware River and used silt for the foundations, even though it was contrary to city code during the late 60s, early 70s when those homes were built. And they are coming out of their pockets every 5 years with thousands and thousands of dollars just to keep their homes safe. Some houses are just, they're leaning against each other, and the houses are the only thing that's holding each other up. These were bad decisions that were made by an administration decades ago. Decades ago. And unfortunately, people are living with those decisions. The city is faced with trying to find some way of making this better, the folks that are here today. But to Allison's point, we have to think outside of the box. We can no longer think traditionally because our world is changing. Our physical world is changing. Technology has been, a big change. And now, my goodness, the pandemic that looks like it's never going to come to an end. We all have to find ways of adapting, staying safe, and still being able to function as a society. And, I found it very interesting, Julia and Allison, how the water department works to address the issues that it needs to address, namely focusing on infrastructure and the long-term projections of what could happen, over a period of time. Maybe some of us won't even be here by that time, but still, the infrastructure still has to be protected. And Allison giving, us the information about the salt lines and where we are and how climate change and sea level rise can really affect that, because that could affect our very health. We all have to have water. We all have to have clean and sanitary water. But we can't forget the human factor. And that clip, I'm a firm believer that a picture is worth 1,000 words. That is Eastwick today. That could be the entire city of Philadelphia tomorrow if we don't do anything. And I'm just really grateful and thankful that Corey invited me here this evening to talk to you all because you all are our future. It is up to you all to begin to think outside of the box and looking at sea level rise from the various perspectives, from Julia's perspective, from Allison's perspective, and from the community perspective, to come up with some viable solutions. Because this is your world now. This is your world. This is still our world. But as we, each generation has to prepare for the next generation. And sometimes there are issues and circumstances that we can't control, such as climate and those kinds of things, but we can be prepared for it. So what we are working with the city now to discuss the community's alternative. It's an idea, it's conceptual, but it beats a blank. It's thinking outside of the box. I mean, there's certainly other examples of land swap throughout the country. It's been done down in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. I'm sorry, that was no tropical storm, but it can also work here in Philadelphia. And what we are hoping here in Eastwick, given all of our environmental problems, the flooding, the sinking homes, being, sandwiched in between the 5th largest Superfund site in the country, and on one side, an airport on another side, constantly being flown over, right here at I-95, where your carbon footprint is expanded. What we hope to achieve is arriving at some sort of solutions, such as responsible building practices in flood-prone areas, which I think is very appropriate given the issue of the sea level rising and climate change and those kinds of things. How we can reduce carbon footprint by effectively utilizing open green space. How we can protect residents. Where are people going to go? There's nowhere you can go to run from some of these environmental conditions. They're here. So how do we live with them? How do we deal with them? And what we hope that we can do is to help set an example that can be used not only in the rest of the city, but across the country. And we have actually, I've actually been contacted by a number of cities across the country saying, how we heard about you guys' plan. What are you doing? And we're trying to learn from each other. Because this is, it's not just a Philadelphia problem. This is a worldwide problem. And, it's just something that, rather than just existing and living with it, we have to really face it head on and try to work together with our city departments, our elected officials, and each other to try to find some solutions so that we can all exist safely and in a healthy manner and to protect our world. And I don't know what more I can say. So, Corey, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. I think you said it all. That was incredibly moving. And yeah, thank you for that more human perspective on things. I think in academia, it's easy for us to get lost in data, stats. So yeah, thank you. This has just been wonderful. Let's see. I have so many questions from the audience. So let's see. I'm gonna just go around. There are several for each of you. So I'm gonna start with Julia since she went first. And this touches on what Allison brought up in her presentation. Someone had a question about Philadelphia's water intakes. Is there any discussion at PWD about expanding the water portfolio to include sources other than the Delaware and Schuylkill?
Great question. Before I dive in, I just want to thank Allison and Carolyn too for your presentations, and Carolyn for bringing this all back to the human level, because I'm an engineer for water utility. It's also easy for us to get lost in the data and the analysis and the planning, but at the end of the day, we need to be moving to implementation and figuring out the governance structures we need to have in place, the funding mechanisms that we need to go after to get this work done. So thank you so much for that, for your words. Going back to our intakes and our sources. Yeah, to my knowledge, we haven't really been exploring the expansion of our supply portfolio. I kind of think about this question in terms of water quantity and quality. In terms of water quantity, we really, we're lucky in the Northeast region to not have the issue of water shortage like many utilities and communities do out west, or at least not nearly to the degree they're dealing with. So that hasn't really prompted the need to look at other sources, just the quantity issue. But everything Allison presented on the quality side and the salinity side of things could potentially, trigger us to look at other sources that we could draw on to reduce the risk related to losing a certain amount of water supply due to salinity intrusion. But I'd say we aren't there yet with, we're still in the midst of all the modeling we're doing to evaluate various scenarios. And I think those conversations will be happening in the next few years about what specific adaptation strategies are realistic and on what timeline we need to get those implemented, whether that be something like desalination or reverse osmosis or some kind of treatment technology that would help us deal with the salt, or if it's about like moving the intake or seeking other sources altogether. So I think that conversation is going to be happening in the nearish future. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Julia. The next question is for Allison. This question is, the Northeast region is going to experience heavier rains in the future, so more flow through the rivers. How do you think that would impact flushing the salt line? Are we taking that into account in modeling and scenarios?
Well, Julia can probably speak more to what's happening with the modeling than I can. They're a little closed-lipped about it, PWT. So my understanding is from the climate change modeling I've looked at is it's actually a little unclear what's going to be happening with rainfall in the mid-Atlantic area, but it likely won't be getting drier. It could stay the same. It could be getting wetter over in aggregate over the year. The challenge is maybe twofold. One of them is that it could be just more intense storms. And if that's the case, it doesn't really change the flow down the river on a day-to-day basis. So maybe you'd have these flashes of fresh water downstream, but it's not like the overall volume will get higher, really. The other thing is that one of the big tools for managing salinity in the river is these reservoirs. And the storage behind the reservoirs will likely not change. In fact, if you get more intense storms, as opposed to them scattered like evenly, it's actually a little harder to capture rainfall. So it's possible that it wouldn't positively impact the storage at all, and thus not really change the tool for managing salinity. So I would say all in all, the change in precipitation won't have a big impact in the way that salinity is managed in the river.
That makes a lot of sense.
I don't have anything really to add. I think that's that sounds right to me. And I'm not involved directly in the modeling that our teams are doing, but I know the Delaware River Basin Commission is also doing their own modeling work. So hopefully, again, we'll start bringing in different climate change scenarios to all of this work that will include like precipitation increases and also the sea level rise component. So
great. Perfect. The next question is for Carolyn. It's we got a couple of similar questions, so I'm going to try and amalgamate them. So could you talk more about the land swap idea? Specifically, Celine would like to know more details about the land swap idea on vacant lots, and then a couple other components,
Sure.
what needs to happen to make that a reality.
Sure, and I just replied, and this goes for everybody. I can always be reached at eastwickunited@gmail.com, but I will explain to you more about the land swap idea. Again, we have there's large tracts of vacant land here in Eastwick that are not in a 100-year floodplain where the flood-prone homes are built. They're built on a 100-year floodplain. So the concept was, number one, let me step back and just say a preliminary survey was taken among the residents, and they all want to remain in their community, but they want to feel safe. That's only natural. Now I'm going to take you back to the late 50s. The community that you see here today in Eastwick is a product of a failed implementation of one of the largest urban renewal programs in the history of this country. 10,000 people were displaced from this community. 10,000 businesses, homes, and churches. In a promise for a new Philadelphia, a suburban or an urban community with a suburban feel to it. That was the intent. However, there were a number of things that took place along the way, during the development of this community, and things just didn't turn out the way it didn't been planned. That urban renewal plan has never been fulfilled. This community has never gotten what it was promised. So that there's 128 acres of vacant land that's been sitting back there vacant for over 60 years. For over 60 years now. The developer was supposed to build single-family houses, and contrary to zoning code, he wanted to build more apartments back here. And the community said, no, you're supposed to build single-family houses. Now you build your single-family houses. So the city asked for the developer to release his options on the land. And the developer says, well, city, you have to pay me to release my options, and walk away. So the developer was paid $13 million to walk away from a contract he never fulfilled. And we were left with a field of weeds back here. A field of weeds. $13 million to not do what you contracted to do. We should all be so lucky to get a deal like that, right? So yeah, read all about it. Just Google, read all about it. I see heads shaking and eyes going back in your heads. Yeah, it's an unbelievable story. So nonetheless, what we're saying is, listen, it wasn't these homeowners' fault that their homes were built on along two creeks that converge. They shouldn't have been built. It was not the homeowner's fault that the developer was allowed to dredge the Delaware River and construct their homes on silt that could not hold the weight of a home, and that was contrary to city code even at that time. So the idea is, number one, safety, keep people safe. Number two, keep them in the community. And number three, make them whole. Why not do replacement housing on the city-owned, the buildable portion of the city-owned property, and at no cost to them to construct those homes, and then just swap the deed, the title to the properties that they are currently in, give it to the city. Give it to the city. It's in an area that is flood prone anyway. It could be made into wetlands, which is very valuable. The city could raise money. They could use it as, or sell it to some sort of a conservation land trust. In fact, the non-buildable portion of the 128 acres the community could then sell the wetlands to a conservation land trust for tax credits. The land trust could then donate it to Heinz Refuge to manage, and Heinz Refuge is right in our backyard. So it makes sense. All the necessary components are there. The sales proceeds could go toward the construction of the housing. Funds that we might be able, hopefully we'll be able to get from the infrastructure bill that was just passed, could also help offset the cost for the construction of the homes. If a person's home is paid for now, why shouldn't their home be bought and paid for then, the replacement house? If you have 10 years left on your mortgage now, you should have 10 years left on your mortgage in your replacement home. That's being made whole. They're safe, they remain in the community, and they are made whole. After Hurricane Floyd back in 1999, I believe FEMA offered to buy out the homeowners. They offered them a buyout. Here's what the buyout looked like. First of all, I don't know if many of you have ever been to Eastwick, but we're row houses. There might be 8, 10, 12 houses in a row that's connected. All of the residents in that row that's connected had to agree to take the buyout. If one person said, nope, I don't want to sell my home, I want to stay, that meant nobody could go. So that's not even feasible. That's not feasible to do. Also, in our long-term thinking, now, I'm not in the construction industry, certainly not when it comes to building dams and levees or arcs or whatever it needs to do to stop the flooding. But it would seem to me that if it's decided that a levee should be built or a dam should be constructed or some sort of something, that they're going to have to move people out of the way in order to build that structure. You can't lay carpet in a room full of furniture. So if we did a land swap now, getting people out of the way, that puts us ahead of the game. While, and to Julia's point, or Allison, I'm not sure who made the statement, but it takes like 30 years or so to build a structure. We don't have 30 years. Human life, we don't have 30 years to wait. We don't know when. We know that a storm is coming, but we just don't know when. We cannot afford to wait for somebody to say, yeah, we think we have to build a levee or we have to build a dam. That's just not going to happen. We got to get folks out of harm's way today. And to me, it seems to me that the most expeditious way of doing that is to get those folks over to higher ground, make them whole, keep them in the community, because where are they going to go? Where are they going? You don't want a repeat of what happened 60 years ago when you displaced 10,000 people. That's just not a good look. That's what they call the new gentrification. And if you have another alternative, why not? Why not? We have a chance to get it right this time. We can learn from the past. We don't have to repeat the mistakes that were made by our predecessors. Now, all of the particular details, they all have to be worked out. Again, it's conceptual, but it's also been done before. So I hope that helps to put things in a little bit of perspective.
Definitely. I'm excited to see where the plan goes.
We are too.
All right, great. So let's see. Thanks, Celine, for that great question. So let's see. The next one is for Julia. If you have implemented any projects in those areas, did you see any of the adaptations prove themselves during either of the summer storms?
So we haven't implemented any projects that are solely for climate resilience. That's what the phase of work our program is slowly transitioning into, is figuring out what specific strategies we need to implement. So I'd say just from the climate resilience perspective alone, we didn't have any projects in place that we could kind of observe how they function during those storms. We did have significant damage during Ida at one of our drinking water pumping stations on the Schuylkill River. And the Schuylkill River, where our treatment plants are located and where the pumping stations are located, is non-tidal. So it's not impacted by sea level rise and storm surge. But what happened during Ida was that we got so much rainfall upstream of us in the Schuylkill River watershed that the flow just became so high, it overtopped the banks of the Schuylkill. And I think, don't quote me on this, I think the pump station may have been, compromised for maybe like 2 weeks. So luckily we have enough redundancy in our supply systems to be able to manage something like that. But for our team, that actually really highlighted that we've been very focused on coastal flooding impacts, and we need to simultaneously also focus on riverine flooding impacts and figuring out how we're going to incorporate precipitation projections into whatever analyses we decide we need to do, whether it be complex modeling or something that's less complex and maybe just based on looking at like flooding elevations we've observed at our facilities in past storms, just figuring out how we're gonna make recommendations for design flood elevations or other strategies at those plants. So I'd more say we observed, unfortunately, like an instance of damage that really is helping us to refocus our efforts. And the other thing I would add lastly is that, we do have a comprehensive green stormwater infrastructure program. Its primary driver is not to reduce flooding risks. Its primary driver is to manage the first 1.5 inches of rainfall specifically during storm events to help relieve strain on our drainage system and reduce those combined sewer overflows. So we're having conversations, starting to have conversations in the department about what would the design, the planning and design of those systems look like if flood mitigation became one of the primary drivers. And other cities around the country and around the world have started building these larger green systems that are often referred to as cloudburst management strategies that are really intended to reduce localized flooding risks. So I think that's another direction some of these conversations will go down in terms of green infrastructure and flood risk reduction during these types of storms.
Thanks for that answer. I'm sorry to hear that they took damage, but at least it was a learning opportunity, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, it often takes storms like this, right, to prompt action, which is unfortunate, but we need to be as proactive as possible. So that's the goal moving forward.
Agreed. Great. Okay, so let's see. The next question, thanks again, Julia, is for Allison. For augmenting water supplies, is the thought that if the Baxter water intake does end up below the salt line, we would use desal for drinking water, but it would be cheaper because we reduce our use of potable water through rainwater capture for non-drinking water needs?
Yeah, so desalination is super expensive and space intensive, and it doesn't produce large volumes of water. There's some other ways that you would probably want to think about reducing reliance on water from the Baxter intake before you thought seriously about the scale of the desalination facility. So it would likely, one of the things we can think about, Julia talked about how this water quantity versus quality issue and how out west they have they lack quantities. But I think on the East Coast, we can consider how reducing water quality introduces effective water scarcity. So it's like we're experiencing a drought, but the drought isn't caused by lack of water, it's lack of drinkable water. So anyway, reducing our like total use, our volume of water that we use just makes it easier to deal with adaptation strategies afterwards. And then, yeah, if we have to treat water, if there's other strategy there, it's a little bit too much to get into right now, but there's some other strategies that maybe you'd want to use before desalination. But just having a lower amount of drinking or like high quality water that you have to provide makes things easier.
Great, thank you. All right, next one is for Carolyn about outreach and engagement strategies. What are some of the ways community conversations and involvement are structured?
Well, we do have every other month we have community meetings, community-wide meetings. Of course, they're virtual now because of the pandemic. We also, you know, we're actually starting to do a newsletter, you know, to make announcements and keep community informed at the community meetings, and to the greatest extent possible, we do polling just to take the temperature of the community, what their thinking are based on what we present to them. We had an event at the Academy of Natural Sciences in October where a full-blown presentation of this concept was introduced, along with Drexel's science lab that's partnered with us to work on modeling for this concept. And you know, we just try as much as possible to solicit community involvement so that we can provide the education to the community. So it's just, you know, through a series of meetings, and we go out door to door, you know, sometimes if we need to distribute information and just try and make ourselves as accessible as we can. When we have meetings with the city and or elected officials, we share the information and always, you know, include the community, bring that back to the community, and try to get a consensus at every step of the way, because this really impacts them. They've got to be involved.
That just sounds like best practices in community outreach.
And of course, the media has really been our friend. You know, there's been a number of WHYY has done a lot of coverage. Channel 10 has done a lot of coverage. And, you know, that's one of the ways that we can promote the engagement as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. The next question is also for you. What other groups does Eastwick United work with, and what partnerships have you found are most rewarding? I know you just mentioned a couple of media sources.
Right. Well, we work with, there's another community organization back here called Eastwick Friends and Neighbors Coalition. And, you know, we're all part of the same, of the leadership, and we work together to try to, you know, to address this and certainly a myriad of other issues. We work along with EPA, who's, you know, been responsible for initiating and implementing the cleanup of the Superfund site. Philadelphia International Airport is one of our partners. In fact, we have a meeting coming up next week, I think, to talk about, you know, the airlines flying just a bit low for comfort, you know, over the community. And, you know, of course, with the carbon footprint. And we're definitely engaged with the water department. Mike Carroll, he's been a number of our meetings, the managing director, the Office of Resilience here in the city of Philadelphia. So we are really, and of course, the housing agencies, because they do land banking and that kind of thing, and it involves them. So we are really working closely with everybody, and certainly our elected officials, Congresswoman Scanlon's office on down.
Great to hear that there's such a wide coalition of people working on this. That's really great. I know we're just about at time. We have one last question that could be addressed to all three of you, but I want to respect all of your time coming here tonight. Would you be okay with staying on for another 5 minutes for this last question? Okay, great. So this one is specifically, I guess, for the students in the crowd. How can early career planning practitioners and environmental professionals best center issues of environmental equity when thinking about the impacts of sea level rise on historically marginalized populations? Big question.
That is a big question. Great question. Carolyn, I don't want to put you on the spot again. I mean, I guess from your experiences, and then I could maybe add a bit from just
Okay.
my experience.
And I'm glad, I mean, just like Corey did, host these kinds of events, educate others, make it an ongoing dialogue. There are enough, believe me, marginalized communities right here in the city of Philadelphia that you can become involved with. And just, doing your own research, talking to some of the community, the residents in that community, and you can find your niche. While climate change and sea level rise and water quality and all those things, while they are not new concepts, I think we as a society ignored it a little bit too long. And now it's becoming more real, but people still need to be educated about it. And I said this before, this is your world now. This is your generation that you've got to prepare the next generation for. And your involvement now and at this level and really just putting your boots on the ground, I think would be a great way of actually starting those dialogues, getting involved, and really bringing the attention to the issue, because it really deserves it. And so it's up to all of us. And there's something that we can all do to open this dialogue and keep it going. Keep it going.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Carolyn, having these kinds of exchanges where, we're getting multiple perspectives, we're talking about a variety of different issues. Those will continue to be super important. And if there's any silver lining to the climate crisis we're in, maybe it's that we all need to start breaking down our silos, because it's just such a cross-cutting issue. And that can apply to, local government, state, federal, but also across just community organizations and other groups that are involved in this space. I mean, we need everyone at the table to come up with the best possible strategies. As someone who works at a utility, we are trying to do more and more community outreach to make sure that through the planning processes, we are, hearing community voices. We've done a lot of that work through our green infrastructure program. And I know through some other infrastructure projects, our public affairs unit has done a lot of work to engage with the community, and that will continue to be really important with what we do, and educating the community on these issues, how people can take individual action, but also everything that we're grappling with as a utility or as a city in local government. Because yeah, we need everyone at the table. So it's exciting, for you guys to be hearing about these issues and learning about them in school. And I just, there's so much need for students like you moving into, whatever kind of field you decide to go into, or whatever direction, there's just a lot of needs. So it's exciting, it's scary, it's all kinds of things, but yeah, a lot of opportunity.
I don't think I have anything really revolutionary to add here. I mean, Carolyn, thank you so much for all the stories that you've shared today. It's really fabulous to hear them. I think one of the things that's in my mind is that I had a speaker into one of my other classes recently who was talking about how often with sort of novel infrastructure solutions, climate adaptation solutions, she was talking about smart city solutions, there's a big focus on what she called the postcard cities. So the cities you often see in postcards, the big cities out there. And I think one of the challenges that we have too is that a lot of our graduates want to go live in these big cities. And what do we do about all the spaces between? So I want to, I guess I think this for myself, I hope to encourage it with everyone, but think about how we can be helpers in other places, maybe beyond where we're living. Not to come in and drop in and say we can solve all your problems, but how can you like be a true partner and help other people achieve the vision they have for their spots that are not the postcard cities. So something for us to consider. Thanks so much, Corey, for bringing together this event today, and for the rest of the Land Use Planning Club for being here. It's been really fun to chat with you all about sea level rise. These are big issues. I'm so glad you're going to be working on them.
They are big issues. And thank you, all three of you, for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. This has been such a wonderful experience. Yeah, I really have nothing to add other than this has been a pleasure. Thank you all for coming. The recording will be sent out afterwards, and thank you, audience members, for all your amazing questions. Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Bye.